Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. Hey y'all. First off, I'd just like to say how impressed I am with the power that people are drawing up from within in order to battle the police all over the country. Seeing videos and hearing stories from Minneapolis, Atlanta, Oakland, New York City, Omaha, Denver, St. Louis, Tucson, Los Angeles, and so many other places, plus all the solidarity rallies and support coming out here from here and abroad is so heartwarming. This week, you'll know, police in Minneapolis murdered George Floyd, an African-American man, and people were there to videotape it. Since then, people took to the streets. They were met with tear gas and rubber bullets. Some held vigils while others held the streets and set fire to a corner of that world that held them hostage, including a police precinct. The cops present at Floyd's murder were fired, and finally the officer who murdered him was arrested. Last week, police murdered a black trans man named Tony McDade in Tallahassee. Over the prior month and a half, that same police force murdered two other African-American men, Wilbin Woodard and Zachary Jones. On May 13th, Louisville police murdered Breonna Taylor, a medical first responder, during a raid on her home. At a protest on May 28th for Breonna's legacy, 7 people were shot by unknown parties. One of them was in critical condition as of yesterday. Video of the murder by a white retired cop and his son in Glynn County, Georgia, of yet another African-American man, Ahmaud Arbery, was released a few weeks back, sparking protests and eventually led to the arrests of the killers. The police had sat on the videos since Mr. Arbery's killing in February, allowing the killers to walk free during that period of time. This is a central contradiction of not to sound too Marxist, but this is a central contradiction of life in America. American life is built not only on capitalist logic of property over people, but centrally located in it is an anti-blackness that feeds upon and is centrally structured on the destruction of black life and the enslavement of black people. This shows with the police forces that were fundamentally created as slave patrols, forcing the work of poor white people to go and put the constraints of the rich onto the bodies of black folks. Then we have a police force out of that today. And another side to that, obviously, is the genocide from the very beginning of the conquest of Turtle Island, of indigenous people, the moving around of folks based on the needs of capital accumulation and not on their own desires nor the shape of the natural world that they travel with. So here's where we're at. And the pandemic has just, I think, been applying a pressure cooker to all of this, and we're kind of stuck. This rupture that we're feeling right now is an amazing thing. Sadly, it's nothing new, but maybe if it's intense enough, it can actually, when people see what we had before, what we were forced to live through before, maybe this rupture will allow us to imagine and fight for something new. Something not on their terms and by their rules, but something that, a way of life, a new society, new communities that are based on mutual understanding, on our needs, on living in balance with the natural world, on everyone having an equal footing and standing to make their way through the world, and an acceptance of their human needs and desires. Just a little waxing philosophical here. On this episode, we're featuring two voices from Minneapolis, an epicenter of mass demonstrations and uprising following the police murder of George Floyd. First up, you'll hear from Jackie, a professional medic in Minneapolis. Jackie talks about the impacts of the coronavirus on black and brown communities around the city, some of what they saw in the early days of the protests, and the feelings expressed to her about the killing of George Floyd and the problems of police in our racist society. You can find a project of theirs on Instagram by seeking @FemEmpowermentProject. Then, Tonja Honsey, Executive Director of the Minnesesota Freedom Fund, talks about bail and prison abolition infrastructure to get folks out of jail and supporting the people on the streets. You can find them online at MinneapolisFreedomFund.org, and they have various social media sites to pay attention to. Both of the interviewees shout out Black Visions Collective and Reclaim the Block, which are two police abolition projects in Minneapolis, and the Northstar Health Collective. Check our show notes for links to those projects, as well as to links for bail funds for cities where solidarity protests have been met with police repression all across the continent. There's an effort right now to get compassionate release for Jalil Muntaqim, former Black Panther and member of the Black Liberation Army. Jalil has been held by New York State since 1971, and he recently has tested positive for the coronavirus. His attempts at parole over the years have been stymied by police and racist pressures and stacking of the parole board for Jalil's involvement in the death of 2 cops 5 decades ago. This has happened 12 times since 2002, when he became eligible for parole. More info about his case can be found at his support site, freejalil.com, and you can check out an amazing SFBayView article for more info.
And now some words about direct action that we got this morning from a comrade on the streets in Minneapolis. At 8 o'clock p.m. on Friday, blocks from the epicenter of the uprising, we watched from a tent as armored vehicles and hundreds of National Guard advanced on Hiawatha. The curfew was in effect, and the state offered no options for a couple camped outside. The hotels promised to the large encampment across the highway left them and many others behind. The shelters were full. This couple finally found refuge in a large vacant hotel a mile away. The next morning, they awoke to the burning remains of Chicago and Lake and learned that the hotel owners planned to evacuate. With nowhere else to go, but with the community showing up to support, the couple declined to evacuate. Together, we invited displaced and unsheltered neighbors to join us. Overnight, people came in with harrowing stories of terror from police and other white supremacists. National Guard shot rubber bullets at us while we stood guard against the violence. At the time of this writing, nearly 200 people have created sanctuary in the memory of the former shelter worker, George Floyd. We avenge Floyd's death in the flames of the 3rd Precinct and honor his life in the reclamation of hoarded property. We've protected this building by occupying it. There's no going back to how things were. This isn't a Sheridan anymore. It's a sanctuary. So we here at The Final Straw would like to thank this person for sending this our way. It's really inspiring, particularly since while there might not be an uprising in a lot of parts of the country against the police and against authorities in that way, there are a hell of a lot, and have been for a long time, a lot of unsheltered people. And as the economy continues to struggle, more and more people are likely to get evicted. So this kind of direct action is really, really inspiring, and I hope folks take note.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We're caught like a ball!
The state of Ohio has held me captive for a non-crime since 1991. And during that time, I might be the single most vocal critic of the Ohio prison system. They tortured me in 2012, sent me to the Supermax the following year, tossed me in the hole over and over for what I said about them, plotted my assassination, and then exiled me. So, full disclosure, I have a long, long history with the Ohio prison system. But now, given their national coverage, I have to admit that the Ohio prison system is number 1 at infecting and killing its own prisoner population. Out of all 50 states, Ohio's prisons have the highest coronavirus infection rate, and the disease is now burning through the prisoner population. It's absolutely devastating, and the body count is skyrocketing. This should come as no surprise. Since its dubious inception, Ohio has been managed by the dumbest and the dimmest. Its legislature has been dominated by the most conservative party in every era of its history, and has been under the control of Republicans since long before I was born. Ohio governors are usually Republican with minor exception, like Ted Strickland, for instance, who was willing to pander to Republicans by embracing all the stupidest ideas that they care about. When Bob Taft was governor, he distinguished himself by getting named the worst governor in all of U.S. history by a major political magazine. And then, Ohioans re-elected him. Given Ohio's proximity to the Great Lakes in a world with quickly evaporating freshwater sources, Ohio would be an excellent place for just about any business or industry, except for the fact that nobody wants to go there. So, Ohio depends on the same narrow industries that have fueled its economy ever since the settlers slaughtered Tecumseh. As for its tough-on-crime position, no state is tougher. During the hysteria of the 1990s, Ohio built more prisons than most states currently have. Despite a population of only about 12 million people statewide, nowhere near the most populous states, Ohio has remained in the top 5 in terms of its prison population. That means, objectively, no state inordinately locks up more of its population than Ohio does. Prisons are one of Ohio's top employers. If you're not a farmer, and you're not stuffing fat kids into seats on the roller coasters at the amusement park, you're locking felons into cages. That's all you see across Ohio: farms, amusement parks, and prisons. It's a state that has completely given up on its schools, perhaps for good reason. Given the available jobs, no one in Ohio needs to be able to read or do math. And history certainly doesn't matter if you intend to keep repeating it anyway. Ohio spends far more on prisons than it spends on schools. That's a distinction shared by very few states. So few you can count them on one hand. Really. Any state that spends more on prisons than schools is openly and proudly declaring that they love their kids less than they hate yours. They'd rather punish and impoverish someone they expect to offend them rather than reward and enrich their own children. Ohio is a fucking hate hole. And the hate seems to continue increasing, even with the prison budget and the size of the prison population. When John Kasich became governor in 2010, he did a great job talking like a really reasonable, common-sense guy who wanted to do the right thing. But according to a victim who got away, serial killer Ted Bundy talked that way too. In hindsight, given what John Kasich did, Ohio might have been better off electing Ted Bundy. John Kasich fired the prisons director and installed Gary Moore, former chief lobbyist for Corrections Corporation of America. CCA, a private prisons corporation, one of the worst in a bunch of predatory, corrupt profiteers that turn prisons into an industry and destroy our world for their own bottom lines. If you want to know about private prisons and the history behind them and the impact they have on our lives, read Shane Bauer's American Prison. It's awesome. So, Gary Moore came out of that tradition, seeing prisoners not as human beings deserving of compassion and needing empowerment, but as units, detestable and potentially dangerous ones, that needed to be contained as cheaply as possible to the greatest possible profits of his ruthless locker room buddies. Moore eliminated community service programs, destroyed education, and ruined any rehabilitative programming by placing emphasis on Jesus programs. Not the Jesus who was executed as a criminal by the oppressive state, but the prosperity Jesus envisioned by shyster Joel Osteen, the Jesus who wants televangelists to have air conditioning in their dog houses while hungry children sleep on the streets. That Jesus, the Republican Jesus. As a consequence of all this, a pervasive atmosphere of increased anger and rage prevailed among prison employees, really dehumanizing. Lockdowns increased, drugs and hopelessness were ubiquitous, gangs metastasized, violence exploded. JPay, Global Tellink, Aramark, Keefe, and Access Secure Pack all reported record profits. In the meantime, Gary Moore rolled out his projections and even posted a timeline on the prison system's intranet, showing his predictions about how the prison population would incrementally decrease over time with his plans. You could click on that graphic to see the descending line that represented Moore's targeted prison population decrease, and also see the ascending line that represented the population increase that was actually happening. After just a couple of months of that, the whole presentation was scrapped, deleted. Moore gave up on reducing the prison population and instead focused on silencing anyone who recognized that he didn't know what he was doing. He instituted a program of domestic torture, not against real threats to prison order, but against critics. Like most tyrants, Moore couldn't distinguish between those who were in actual danger and those he found personally annoying. Yeah, because that's what Jesus would do. So, after Kasich, Mike DeWine got elected governor and brought in his own crew. Gary Moore went on to North Carolina as a consultant, so he could fuck up their prisons like he fucked up Ohio. And Mike DeWine installed Annette Chambers-Smith as the prisons director. Chambers-Smith came from JPay as their former CEO. She has expertise in maximizing exploitation of prisoners, and no expertise whatsoever in empowering them to be better people. One of her first acts in office was to exile me to Virginia in hopes that I'd never get the chance to talk about her. And yet, here she is. Annette Chambers-Smith is now almost as infamous and almost as deadly as Typhoid Mary. Way to go, Annette. I wonder where she's going to send me next. I hear NASA has started sending people back to space again. But I share all of that in order to make these points that have been largely overlooked as COVID-19 rages through the Ohio prisons. There's a reason this is happening, going beyond the incompetence and the apathy and the pathological obsession to toxify captives with irrational hatred and loathing. It is all that, but it's more. For Mike DeWine and Annette Chambers-Smith and all the irremediable monsters running the state of Ohio, this is a matter of math. Cold and impersonal numbers. COVID-19 is an opportunity to create empty bunks without having to let anyone go. They can decrease the prison population and remain tough on crime. These aren't human beings to them. These aren't mothers and fathers, sons and daughters. These are units. Mike DeWine and Annette Chambers-Smith don't see human suffering. They see the equivalent of gallons of milk taken off the shelf because the expiration date passed. That's why Ohio prisoners are dying. So, this ignominious distinction for Ohio being number one in prisoner infections proves yet again that the worst and most dangerous criminals aren't held in the prisons, they run them. If you've lost a loved one in the Ohio prison system, go to blastblog.noblogs.org to find the home addresses of those you should hold responsible. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at SeanSwain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks. Would you please introduce yourself for the audience with whatever distinguishing characteristics you'd like, a name or preferred pronouns or what have you?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I go by Jackie. My pronouns are they, them. I am in Minneapolis currently. I'm a Chicanx with Indigenous roots person who is originally from the Southwest, and I've been here for several years in Minneapolis. I was living in California and then was in D.C. before Standing Rock and then came out to the Midwest, so I've been in and out of here ever since, and so I currently reside here now.
Thanks for coming on. I appreciate you being willing to talk to me. On May 25th on Chicago Ave South in the Powderhorn neighborhood of Minneapolis, Officer Derek Chauvin of the Minneapolis Police Department coldly and slowly murdered George Floyd. Mr. Floyd was a 46-year-old African-American man and a father, and his killing was witnessed and recorded by onlookers who attempted to talk the cops off of Mr. Floyd as he was suffocated. I just want to say, I'm very sorry for your loss in your community. Would you be willing to talk about just sort of the reaction to this that you've experienced and heard from the people that are around you in Minneapolis?
Yes. Thank you for covering this and for taking the time to do this. People are angry. People are grieving. People are out, have been out ever since, taking the streets. There's been a lot of conversations, and where people are trying to figure out how to support each other, how to call out businesses. There's a lot of like different opinions on how to do things, so it's hard to know like where to start. But I know the big protest that started was the following day on the 26th. Folks gathered where the murder happened, and family and people just from all over the community came and marched to the 3rd precinct. It's probably like under 2 miles, and there's probably been a lot of coverage, but that's where riot gear was brought out and stuff that evening. So that's kind of the beginning of it. I don't know if you have any questions on like events or anything for me.
Well, it seems like thousands of people came into the streets, and like I'm sure all of them were doing different things. But you said riot gear was brought out. How did the police react to like this obviously like emotionally upset and traumatized community of people that were in the streets?
When we marched over there, the cops weren't out, and then as it started to get dark and rainy, then they started using a lot of tear gas. And I've done the anti-police brutality work in Los Angeles, where I'm from, for like several years ago, and in Oakland as well. And I've actually have never been around so much tear gas before at a protest. And so they did that, and once a lot of people dispersed, it got dark. A lot of people there was multi-generational folks out there. There's families out there, youth, elders. And not everyone left Chicago, the original spot in March, but there were a lot of people that were there. So once all the tear gas happened, then a lot of people left. And basically the cops just got more aggressive as the night went on and as it got darker.
And I've heard that they were deploying rubber-coated bullets too.
Yeah, that was a lot of what I was treating. All the people that I treated for rubber bullets were actually young Black women. I imagine other people had gotten shot as well, but that's, from my end as a medic, that's who I was treating. And so, we're seeing that cops are, even during the protests, they're still targeting Black folks. That's what I'm seeing. So it's pretty disheartening and frustrating.
Did anyone lose an eye that you saw? I know, in recent demonstrations over the last few years, when cops have been bringing out rubber bullets, oftentimes that's a really common injury from it.
Right. Not that I know of. There were 2 people that went to the hospital and they were shot in the face. Mm-hmm. The worst one I saw was just above the eye by a couple inches. So yeah, and folks got them safely to the hospital, and it's been amazing to see people work together through this and support each other and be like, yeah, we don't want to call the ambulance. We're going to figure this out, and ask someone around us that they didn't know to that they would trust and get people to where they needed to go safely. So that was amazing to see during the time where it's heightened and it's hard to, in moments like that, it's hard to organize and, when you're in this trauma response to act quickly.
Part of the ignorance of the question, but would avoiding using an ambulance be because of the cost incurred, or because of the police oftentimes showing up alongside of, obviously there were already cops there, but showing up alongside of ambulances?
Both things. It was more, not wanting to get targeted or deal with that, and also the cost. Minneapolis
has over the last 5 years that I could think of off the top of my head, suffered some pretty high profile killings by police. In 2015, there was Jamar Clark. In 2016, there was the filmed killing of Philando Castile. In 2017, Justine Demond. Not that anyone really likes the cops except for other cops, but I would imagine that these and the protests and vigils that followed these killings by police have sort of set a trend of the relationship between law enforcement in that city and the populations. Are those past instances of murder by police being brought out that you're hearing? I've definitely heard echoes of Eric Garner because of the "I can't breathe" last words by George Floyd. Yeah,
definitely being brought up. It's also bringing up, past trauma. People are dealing with grieving of losing people in their communities, and it just happens, and there's not any change. And the mayor wants to fund MPD $8 million. And there's groups like Black Visions Collective who are working to like actively get them to divest in police. And yeah, I mean, those names still come up and people are still grieving from that.
Someone pointed out to me that this is one of the first like large spontaneous like revolts of 2020 in the US, at least since the pandemic and the quarantining. And people have been going really hard in like starting off in the south side, I guess, of Minneapolis and spreading to different neighborhoods. And it's continuing now. And also with solidarity protests popping off in Los Angeles and Chicago and like other parts of the country. Do you think that the mindset of the folks in the street has been like shifted by months of like being under pressure from shelter in place?
I definitely think that. I think people's frustration with, at least here, with MPD, with the governor, with Trump being in office, with not having, options for presidential candidates for people to actually support marginalized folks. I don't know. I think it's been shared for some people around the country that there were folks out here in Minnesota who were protesting the stay-at-home order because they wanted to get haircuts.
Yeah.
So, and there was no police retaliation about that. So there's a lot of frustration that's been built up over the last few months, and I definitely think, all of this is like why people are responding, and people are tired of it, and you can see by the grieving. I feel like it's physically manifesting as like burning buildings and the anger, and it doesn't feel like it's continuing. Like you were saying, it's kind of spreading into different parts of the city, and people are wanting justice.
I guess what I was getting at a minute ago also, this is like right as stories are coming out, and like this is stories, but people experience in their day-to-day life disproportionate effects of policing, whether it be the presence of police in certain neighborhoods, that are drawn by lines of shared racialization, class experience, these things. But folks, in general get more attention, more negative attention from law enforcement if they're Black and brown and poor. And during this time of the pandemic too, it's being studied and being proven that the kind of interactions that people have with law enforcement is the difference between a white person's engagement and a person of color or a racialized person's engagement with law enforcement. Like the difference seems to be being exacerbated by coronavirus. It's like it's giving a carte blanche, so to speak, to the police. Yeah, so I'm sure that is like amplifying stuff that's going on. And then recently, the news came out about police suppression of the video of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, in Glynn County, and the taped killing of Sean Reed in Indianapolis, where like protests were followed by severe repression, again by riot cops. So the 4 cops present were fired very quickly afterwards once public outrage started building and it became visible. And this kind of reaction by administrations is almost unheard of. And like, not surprisingly, the police union has promised to stand behind their officers, Thin Blue Line and all that. But I wonder, do you think that the logic of the pigs and the city officials, at least in this instance, was that they understood the pressure cooker situation that they were under, and this is like a way of letting off steam or mitigating the effects of these applied oppressions?
I'm not sure about everyone's opinions, but from some folks I've talked to, they're like, it's kind of performative because they're giving them all this funding. Folks are saying like, it's a quick response to try to diffuse the situation a little bit, but I think people are refusing to take that as enough.
I was talking with someone earlier today. They were asking, they were like, hey, so what's your opinion of what's going on and like the unrest that's occurring and the destruction of property? And I kind of tried to explain as best as I could of my understanding from having observed and, heard people's responses over the years that I've been alive, at least every time there's a police killing and like rage builds. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you have any observations about like why buildings get burned and why people take to the streets in these ways.
Yeah, I think people feel like they don't have other ways to be heard. And I think people are trying to make a point like, not being represented by people in office. We're not getting the support we need. People already have health risks pre-pandemic, especially during the pandemic, or the things that they need. There's essential workers who are, or undocumented folks who are just like forced to be in unsafe situations. So it's just like all of these things on top of, you know, the police brutality and all these other injustices that are happening. It's like, how do people be heard? And I know that there's different routes that people are doing it. Some people are burning things and some people are doing, you know, peace vigils. And I think people are all grieving differently, but mostly it seems like people want to be heard. And I think people lighting a building is like them trying to call attention to the fact that like this building is more important for some people than like someone's life. And I think it's just a strong point that's being made. And I don't know, that's my observation, or like that's what I think is going on with that.
Whole swaths of the mostly like white population sees footage of rioting and is just like, people are just burning their own neighborhoods, and seem to have like such a disconnect from people's intentions or motives or whatever. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
People who are getting footage are also getting the thing that like grabs the most attention. And there are people, like I was saying, there's where the murder happened, like in that part of the city, people are intentionally not being violent and doing a peace vigil there because the community has like discussed that, you know, the ways that people want to express their grief like is happening, and we want to like make space for people to also like, for elders and people who want to heal in a different way to do that. And so people have decided to do it there. And I think like that's not on the news. And there's people who are, you know, I'm working with some herbalists, and we're basically like, how are we making sure people are taking care of each other emotionally, and during this time, even if they're not in the streets, because there's a lot of people who are doing work who aren't out there. And, you know, we're talking about doing herbs and opening up gardens to people, and still working in these different ways that isn't on the media. So I think there's that. So there's like the stuff that isn't on the media, and then there's if you lose somebody, like you could burn all the buildings you want. It's not going to bring people back. So I don't know. I think it's kind of a tough thing to answer. And I think it's sometimes hard to know if you're just not connected to someone who's affected by it, or haven't been, if there's just like a disconnect to the community or the experience. It's hard to understand and explain that to people, and it's actually hard for me to find the words right now too. So
yeah, that's fair. Mm-hmm. This is the File Straw Radio, and you're hearing Jackie, a medic from Minneapolis, talk about grief and rebellion over the police murder of George Floyd. I guess switching gears a little bit, would you speak a little bit about what it's been like as a trained medical professional during this pandemic? Like, according to the state health department's websites and daily numbers, Minnesota shows like a constant uptick. And I guess since the 17th, the stay-at-home order or shelter-in-place or whatever it's called, state by state, it changes name, wasn't renewed. And there were those pushes like by mostly white men with guns to reopen the economy so they could go fishing or so that they could get haircuts or whatever. Like, I'm wondering if as a medical professional, you could talk about like what your experience of the pandemic's been like in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I'm nationally registered as an EMT. I haven't been working as a medical professional, like for money, but mostly just on the ground for support with things like this. I do have friends who are paramedics and nurse practitioners who are either directly affected or like working in the pandemic, or who are in other, you know, not in ICU, but still working in the hospitals right now. And
like in Chicago and Seattle and New York have been distinctly like were hit during that first, and I wasn't sure if comparatively Minneapolis was up there.
Yeah, I think we've been on the lower end of the numbers since we've started seeing more cases in March. It seems like we were like 3 weeks behind California, like in their, like seeing their trends. And a doctor here that I know was saying that it seems like the peak will be in August. And there's some opinions I've heard that opening up the economy is like public pressure, you know, pressure from different businesses for the governor to do that. And I think what I've seen in the last couple of months is doctors or medical professionals who don't have the right proper PPE, and they were still going to work. And that was heartbreaking. I had some people make masks, reusable masks for people, and my friend who distributed them to healthcare workers said that, they still hadn't had new PPE, and this is like in, March. And they've gotten some since, but originally, there wasn't a strong support network for them. And there were people who were doctors who were just having to stay isolated from their family for a month. And it just seems like there can be more support for them. And I don't know, I feel like we haven't peaked yet. And especially after this is all happening and people were social distancing, and now, we'll see what happens in like a month, 2 weeks to a month, if cases rise because of this police murder. But I feel like seeing some things happen in the country, we're not in like really bad shape compared to other states like New York, but there still could be a lot more support for medical workers.
Yeah. Well, and then also besides the protests against the police killing, there's the state's reopened pubs and for certain amounts of seating, as well as outdoor seating for restaurants. And it's inviting people to be within 20 feet of each other and interacting with, a server and that person interacting with the back of house. And it seems like even without people going in the streets, and people have been according to the videos that I've watched, a lot of people are wearing masks, and it's not simply masks for the point of obscuring their identities.
Right. But
also because they're this is real, and also I need to be out here.
Yeah, and that's been, on Tuesday I was out and I had a bunch of masks to hand out, and I only actually handed out 2. Most people had them.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and there are a lot of parks out here where people are, walking, but there's a lot of people I've seen who are not social distancing, or they're out without a mask, but they're staying socially distant. And I have noticed that it seems like a socioeconomic divide of who is being more lax and who is being more strict about it. And so before these protests, there's definitely a divide of how people are taking it seriously and not. And it's frustrating, but yeah, I think people that I've seen out in the streets are really trying to take care of each other and do the best they can to distance. And there are some instances where you can't do that, or if we have to respond medically, it's hard to not put my hands on someone, but I have the appropriate gloves. But there's just people out there handing out, have hand sanitizer and handing out, gloves, and people are really supporting each other during the protests. So
that's really awesome. That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about the communities that you've been working with and providing care and access to, and what kind of access they have to infrastructure? I know that around the country, one of the perpetual problems that's been expressed is the lack of testing availability, or these maybe untrustworthy antibody tests that are circulating. What sort of impacts from the pandemic and the shutdown of public services have the folks in your communities been affected by? And also, can you talk about why, in your opinion, there are so many disparities in infection rates along racial and class lines? Maybe the impact of compounding traumas, for instance.
Yeah. From what I've seen in marginalized communities, there's folks who are already dealing with more environmental stressors, just already having more underlying health conditions, or access to care, or different quality of life. So all those compounded stresses can affect their immune system, and stress levels. Having higher amounts of cortisol can lead to being more vulnerable to being sick. So I think the fact that marginalized folks are already dealing with a lot of things makes them greater at risk.
So I've been working with a mutual aid group around here, and some of the work that we've been doing has been to provide services mostly for the houseless community, providing food throughout the day and sanitary items and camping gear and stuff like that. And these are services that normally would be provided by existing nonprofits that are limited in their ability to have people congregate in one space or to be able to, at this point, like distribute food or drink from those spaces. And so because of that, and because of like the closing down of public spaces where they might be able to get water, like the ability to, in their case, like ask for money from people or use a business's bathroom or like to wash their hands or just use the restroom. All of these things kind of compound to create increased stress levels, like on top of the fact that the resources that they would normally be accessing are closed down due to the health concerns for the people that work there or for like social distancing purposes. So I'm wondering if you have any anecdotal experience of how you've seen the shutdowns due to the pandemic, like exacerbating the existing problems that people face in accessing healthcare or like safety needs.
That's definitely been happening. People not having as much access to that stuff, especially like in March. There's still snow out, so people are already trying to find shelter, and not there's not being as many places to go for meals. So I've seen people struggling with that, but there has been a community response here. People have been going out every day to a park called PV Park, like 2 hours a day, and we'll distribute like hand sanitizer and food and different things that people need. So it still does. I don't think it addresses all the food, like the kitchens and things that aren't open and shelters and that stuff. But there's people on the ground who are trying to get those supplies out, and I know like Southside Harm Reduction has been out too, helping folks to get things that they need, get out Narcan and other things. And originally, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was taking prep food out to people, and not so much staging up in one place, but just going to where I know people were sleeping. Mm-hmm. But for those folks, it seemed like not a lot had changed, minus they had like access to less things. So I haven't been out so much since. I don't have too much to say on it, just so I'm not sure, but I do know that people have been out there every day trying to make up for that.
Well, I was gonna basically at this point ask about if there are any resources that people on the outside could either be like any media sources that you think are doing a pretty good job of on the ground reporting of what's going on, or handing the mic over to people in the community to actually express their concerns and their feelings as they're going through like not only the pandemic crisis, but also this like grieving process of losing one of their community members. And also if there's any organizations that you would suggest that people on the outside who do have resources could put money towards, like any anti-repression funds or any PPE organizations. Mm-hmm.
So for media, I have a couple. There's Unicorn Riot. They've been out there, and they're they're a well-known like media source that I would suggest folks follow. There's someone who has done a lot of work at Standing Rock and in different movements here, who used to work for Unicorn Riot, who is Chicanic, Indigenous person. Their name is Lorenzo Serna, so you can find them on like Facebook. They do a lot of live streaming and are in community with folks from Unicorn Riot. Yeah. I know Black Visions Collective has a website, and they are taking funds, and they've been working proactively to demilitarize and defund police. Northstar Medic Collective, they are receiving supplies from people, and they're on the ground. I think it's Herbal Justice Network. There's a lot of work there. They are also, they're doing herbal support, and some of them work as medics as well, and are doing a lot of emotional support work as well for folks and health with using medicine and herbal medicine. Jail support, I haven't heard about too many, minus Freedom Fund, Minnesota. And I actually just put a call out for POC medics. So I am actually working with folks who I used to work with when I was I worked with them actually with Line 3 resistance like in the last couple years up here in northern Minnesota, but they also do stuff in the Southwest. and they're frontline medics, so they're not here, but they're actually helping me set up a all POC medic training this weekend. So I would say support frontline medics, and then I do my own grassroots organizing, which is more just POC based, like wellness and like direct action skill shares and things like that. And I'm using that platform for money for people around the country who like I know but don't necessarily want to give to big groups, and that's at Fem Empowerment Project. So that's another way too to just like be updated and like ask questions or give money to allocate more on a grassroots level.
Thank you very much. Are there any things that we didn't talk about that you want to talk about? Are there any questions that I failed to ask?
Not that I can think of, and probably just because my mind's in like 10 different places.
Yeah.
So I feel like those are really thoughtful questions that you asked.
Thank you. Jackie, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. And yeah, I wish you like health and stay safe. And thanks for doing all that good work.
As protests heat up, the Channel Zero Network has some reminders on how to stay safe while out in the streets.
Bring buddies and don't let them out of the range of your voice.
Write a legal aid number on your bodies so you can get help if you get arrested. Be sure to know your buddies' legal names and birthdays. You'll need these to help find them if they're arrested.
When moving around, walk, don't run. Stick together.
Turn off your phone while out in the streets to avoid surveillance of your location and so as not to have your unlocked phone taken by the authorities or other bad actors.
Try your best not to stick out in a crowd. Cover up tattoos with clothing or body paint. Cops will use footage from the protest to try to identify you.
Wear clothes that are good for moving quickly. Avoid wearing jewelry and wear closed-toed shoes.
Wear your mask at all times, even if you're talking to someone, in order to guard yourself against surveillance, COVID-19, pepper spray, and tear gas.
Avoid wearing contact lenses. Bring goggles of some kind in case of tear gas or pepper spray.
Consider wearing bike helmets, as police often cause head injuries with batons and other weapons.
Don't take photos or videos of people doing anything illegal or with their faces uncovered. Whenever possible, film the cops, not the protesters.
Only put water in your eyes. Don't use milk or baking soda or anything else. Clean water is the safest thing to use at a protest. If possible, bring a water bottle to drink from and a water bottle to flush out the eyes of any comrades who are maced or tear gassed.
And white comrades are encouraged to follow the lead of black and brown comrades as they bear the brunt of state brutality.
Follow Unicorn Riot and Channel Zero Network member It's Going Down for ongoing updates.
The Channel Zero Network sends you all solidarity.
Stay safe out there and never stop fighting for a better world.
Next up, let's hear Tonja Honsey talk about the Minnesota Freedom Fund, bail support, and abolition. Could you please introduce yourself for the audience with your name, pronouns, location, or any identifying info you want to give?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Tonja Honsey, she, hers, and I am the executive director of the Minnesota Freedom Fund here in Minneapolis, St. Paul area. I'm an incarceration survivor and spent over 3/4 of my life incarcerated, in and out of incarceration, and also a community member and continuing to try to build our community.
Can you talk about the work that the Minnesota Freedom Fund does?
Yeah, so the Minnesota Freedom Fund, it was built in 2016. It was started by Simon Cecil, who took it on as a grad school project and realized that, you know, it needed to be something that was long lasting in our city. And from that, decided to turn it into a nonprofit. And it was volunteer run for most of its time. And then I was brought on as the executive director in January of 2019. And we work primarily in Hennepin County, have started working in Ramsey County. So that's Minneapolis and St. Paul. We use bail funds in bailing people out of jail as a harm reduction tool. And we work to abolish cash bail at its core and to really reform the whole system into understanding that we do not need to extract wealth from communities that have the least, just for freedom, right? And we work to end family separation. We work to end ICE detention. And so we are unique in the fact that we not only do criminal bails, but we also do ICE bonds as well.
With the criminal bail stuff, can you talk a little bit about like what's actually wrong with the bail system? Most countries don't have a bail system. Many countries like that based off of English law actually got rid of the bail system. But can you talk about how it works to the detriment of people who live at the intersections of like racialization, of poverty, indigeneity in a lot of cases, but being Black or brown, and sort of the outcomes that result from that during people's court?
Right. So, yeah, the reason the cash bail is so unjust is because it, like I said, it extracts wealth from the communities that have it the least when we're talking about Black, brown, and indigenous and poor communities. And so when someone is arrested, it could be the same charge. One person could be from, a poor community, and they're arrested, they're brought in, they're detained, and there's a use of what's called in a lot of places, there's what's used a pre-sentence risk assessment tool. And from that, they're looking at, do you own a home or do you rent? Have you moved in the last couple of years? Do you have a job? Do you not have a job? And looking at all those things, that's how they determine who is worthy of freedom or not. And if you come from privilege, those things are automatically going to be, different, right? Another thing that they look at is your past criminal record or alleged criminal record, your past failures to appear. Well, we know that people don't fail to appear out of a choice or an act of rebellion. They're failing to appear because they have jobs that they can't miss. They have no transportation. They have no childcare. They can't miss their job because of, they won't have the lack of funds then to live. Or just looking at the fact that what people go through walking into a courthouse in the fear and the, post-traumatic stress disorder that people have, that they're not going to be able to go home. We know that 80% of the people that post bail, that we are posting, that nationally are posting, are returning to court on time and, and complying with everything. It's the same statistic if someone post fail themselves. So it's not any different. We're not seeing differences there. We know that the outcomes of someone that is able to fight their case and, when they're not incarcerated, the statistics are much higher of them, the charges being dropped or them being able to get a diversion program. But really at the core of it is these folks do not have money to pay bail. Having to make the choice between paying a bail or providing food for your kids. What it does is leads people to continue into that economy, the underground economy. If I'm a single mom and I get picked up or something and I'm given a choice, do you want to pay this $100 for a bail or do you want to sit in jail? Well, I have to pay that $100. Well, that $100 was what I needed for rent. So that forces people to, how am I going to make that up to be able to survive? If people are incarcerated with, bails, we also know what it does. It separates family. People lose their children. They lose their housing. They lose their jobs. They lose their vehicles. They're separated just from community, and what that does to them mentally and emotionally. It continues to oppress those people that come from so much oppression and, centuries of oppression.
Well, can you talk about when y'all started focusing on trying to get people's release from ICE detention? What spurred that and what those conversations look like and how much that's been able to happen?
This was before I came on to work with the Freedom Fund, but Linus Chan, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School in the New Americans department, he has been doing immigration law with his students and on his own for quite some time. That's his heart. That's just everything that he does. And he actually approached Simon Cecil and said, hey, I would really like to be able to bring my expertise of, immigration, and I would be able to, bring that to the table. Is it something that you'd want to partner on? And they absolutely, it's criminalization is criminalization. And, at the heart of it is immigration and people being detained by ICE, which is so much more complicated even than the criminal bail system. So he took that on, and we've taken that on, and I can say that it's a pretty heartbreaking work for myself. It's also very rewarding to know that just the desperation and the hopelessness that people feel, because if someone's bail is set at, $5,000, it might as well be $5 million in most cases. We're talking about poor families usually that are affected the most, and just really losing hope of ever being able to be with their family member again, and to be able to be a part of an organization that is like, nah, we're going to get you out. You're coming home. You're going to be with your family. And, the being able to fight their cases and being able to push off their next court appearances, because it's so backed up that if someone is out, we're able to get them out, they're pushing it off even further. So that gives them even more of a chance to be able to win their cases and to fight to be able to be with their family.
Last fall, we got a chance to talk with folks from Little Village Solidarity Network, based out of Chicago, which does a lot of work around pushing back against, in particular, like family separation and child detention, but immigration detention in general, because it's community separation. And one of the points that struck me and seems kind of like hardest to understand for a lot of parts of the U.S. documented population is there's a lot of propaganda about, for instance, like youth that are going into immigration or ICE detention. The government makes the argument that they can't be released out of it because they were either the victims of trafficking or they don't have family on the outside. And I know that a lot of legal, this is like a federal issue, but a lot of the people getting out on parole, probation, I would imagine bond also is like, you're supposed to be able to go to like a stable residence, makes you less of a flight risk, like you said, with like owning property. But I know that a lot of like undocumented folks are afraid to, because of what the federal government does with their social networking understanding of like where communities are, who's related to who might not have documentation also, it becomes difficult to have someone come forward and say, hey, yeah, that's my cousin, that's my niece, that's my relative, they're undocumented, you can release them to me. Is that a thing that y'all have found when trying to gain release for folks in ICE detention, that it becomes difficult out of like legitimate fear that the government's going to misuse that information?
Well, yeah, we do. I mean, a lot of times what we find too is like, we want to tell success stories of like, hey, we're able, here's where your support went to, and this is what's happened. And we can't do that, because it risks their safety, right? And there's no, ICE doesn't go by any laws, because it's people that are not, what we would call citizens don't have rights. So there isn't a legal procedure that we can say, hey, but you're violating their rights. Well, they don't have rights. It doesn't matter. So they can detain you and keep you for any reason, and they don't have to let you go. And so it is navigating that. And I myself don't have a part in that, because we work so closely with the law school and other attorneys that they were privileged and grateful that they have those things in place before we go down. We're just really, we come in on the back end, like, okay, awesome. We got the funds. We'll go pay that. We'll give the information. And that's really our piece. The real work is happening with the attorneys, and, there's other organizations that are setting up, rides and doing those, although, what we would say is more the frontline work. Mm-hmm. And we get to come in and be the feel goods. Here we go. We get to pay your bond, and you get to go home. It takes a partnership, but like I said, we don't come across that much. Our organization doesn't, but definitely the attorneys do.
Oh, and just because you said the word, for anyone who has had the privilege of not having an interaction with bail or bond in the U.S., could you briefly just say what a bond is and how it relates to bail?
Yeah, so a bond is different than bail, right? Bond can be on a federal level more so, and we put up all of that money there. It's a bond. It's more of a legal differences. Bail is paid directly to the jail, and it's not a bond, right? We're not bondsmen, and so that's the difference too with us. And sometimes that gets confusing for people. Is that we're not a bail bond organization. We actually fight against that predatory lending strategy that happens. We actually go in and pay the whole bail. So we're not bonding people out of criminal court. We're bailing them out. We're paying all of it. So they come out and they don't have any obligation to pay that back.
And the difference being that like a bondsman or, whatever, that sort of business, or as you say, like predatory loan, they'll take 10% of the money and they'll basically put up the rest of it and say like, if this person jumps bail, then I will go and collect and they won't get that money back. But as opposed to paying the full bail, your organization actually puts in much more money, but it actually gets that money back, right?
Yep.
So the outcomes that we're talking about are compounded by, like, there's the outcomes of having to sit while awaiting trial or a hearing or whatever, and not being able to sustain some sort of or do the research to build your case, or like having your kids be without income or without childcare, what have you. There's also obviously there's this thing called a pandemic that's going on. And I was wondering how the coronavirus has compounded the difficulty of people that are awaiting bail, and what sort of efforts shifting has looked like during the pandemic of the Minnesota Freedom Fund. How has the work that you've been doing shifted since the pandemic has taken hold?
We push to release people, right? Release people you shouldn't charge a bail for people. Stop arresting people, stop detaining people, because it's now become life and death, right? We see, especially around the country, all the spread in county jails, in state prisons and federal prisons, of how many incarcerated people are contracting the virus, and there's no way for them to be able to care for them in a way that it should be. So release them. And we've seen in Ramsey County, who I work really closely with to do decarceration efforts and to be able to do working towards ending cash bail. And within a week of it really blowing up in the United States, we were able to half the jail population and over half get to decrease the population in the workhouse. And, that was a huge effort, and that was without having to post any bail for people. That was really more of the work that we're really pushing towards, is we have this fund and we want to continue to push into this fund, but honestly, just release people. Release them. You shouldn't need to use our money or their money, their family's money, or anybody's money to release them. And so that's what we've seen, a lot of really good work happening from that. Some of the things that have made it more difficult is, we've been at a stay-at-home order, and now it's a modified stay-at-home order since March. And so we've cut back on using our volunteers and to posting bail. We have one jail coordinator that we use, and dropped back down to using posting bail one time a week, just to mitigate the risk of our staff, our employees, our volunteers contracting the virus, but also the risk of us bringing it into facilities too. So it's been difficult to navigate, but we're still out here posting bail. We've been able to post bail for other organizations around the country with the ICE office, because ours didn't close. So we were able to pay bonds for people all over the country, and just really brought our community even more tighter to saying, hey, yeah, we are able to do this. Send us the information we need and we can go and post for them.
Yeah, that's awesome. This is the Final Straw Radio, and you're hearing Tonja Honsey of the Minnesota Freedom Fund. Where does the funding, it's cool that because you're doing the bail and it's so much more money, but because you're getting that back when people show up for court, you're not decreasing the amount of money that you have in your coffers on a regular basis by paying the bond. But how do y'all fund it?
Most of it we get by individual donors. We have ongoing donors that are reaching out to us, either doing one-time donations or they're doing ongoing donations for us. We do have some local funders some local churches that will send us more funding, some philanthropists that are sending us money, but the majority of it is our individual donors.
In your estimation, how much do the local governments, how much are they actually making off of the bail system? Is it a large proportion of a county's income?
I think it's significant. It's significant because if it's, one of the things about the bail system as it stands, especially in Minnesota, what happens is, if I pay someone's bail, and they go to court, and the judge says, okay, yep, we've completed this. Now we're going to charge you court fines and fees, but we're just going to take it out of the bail that you posted. And so that they're making sure that they're capturing their money before it's going back into the community. So you can't just look at what they're getting through bail and forfeited bails, but also how they're using it to capture and take fines and fees. And so they can say, oh, well, you paid $1,000, so we're just going to take that $1,000. So we've seen that it's brought the set point of what those fines and fees are set at. So, and then they're just recaptured that way. So it is something that the counties are profiting off of, or have buried within their budget of revenue.
Jackie Wang wrote pretty well about this in Carceral Capitalism, like looking at how the county that Ferguson, Missouri sits in, where similar to what's going on right now, like a police killing sparked a massive investigation about the way that carceral capitalism, the way that police brutality engages upon poor Black and brown and just poor in general bodies. One of the essays in that book talks about this shift from collecting property taxes on portions of the community that may own business, or taxing businesses, that public revenue, instead of that, gets taken from extracted out of poor populations, like you mentioned before. Mm-hmm. And it seems to be a generalized shift of suburban American reality. And especially when you're tacking on fees for people missing court dates, as you said, because they have no childcare, they can't miss a shift, or transportation issues. Yeah, it's quite the trap.
It is a trap. And in that, we've looked at, there's been studies done that in Minnesota, I believe that it was the University of Minnesota had done a study that showed that not only were indigenous communities being jailed and prosecuted at higher rates and, incarcerated at higher rates, but their fines and fees were also set at higher rates. And I would imagine that it's the same for other communities of color, that they're doing the same thing. And it's they're continuing to tax the poor, tax the poor, and to keep them at this set line. And, and it's the same thing too with sentencing guidelines, right? Your sentence is going to be higher if you have a criminal, history. They're looking at your criminal history. And we, as the Freedom Fund and myself, continuously push back on that. If you're policing a neighborhood more so, of course they're going to have a history, right? Because you're putting all your resources into policing this one community. So they're getting pulled over. They're getting, stopped. They're getting all these, they're having much more interaction with police. If you were to go into an upper class white neighborhood, they're going to be doing the same things, but they're not getting that contact with police the same that we are. And so we can't, if we're going to talk about equity and justice, and we can't use criminal history scores to decide if someone gets a bail, what their sentence is going to be, or how high that bail should be.
Because there have been all these efforts around the country to, during the pandemic, call for the release of more people that are in for ICE custody, that are in for these minor infractions, that are awaiting bail. There's been this very legitimate call for not giving people a potential death sentence by putting them into these petri dishes during the pandemic. Have you seen any sort of shift in the general view around incarceration, with the argument that, well, if you could release them now, why did you have them in there in the first place?
Oddly enough, one of the counties that we work with here in Ramsey County, before we even as the community brought this up to them, they were already in discussion of, hey, we released people, they're out in the community, and there wasn't something, there was an increase in crime. There wasn't, there weren't these people that were running madly through the streets. And guess what? They can show up to court. They're the ones that are being flexible now. We don't, there was no court. Great. We'll come back when there is. Or how are we going to, mediate the influx of court dates that are going to be happening right now? We've been pushing for, instead of having to appear in court, why can't we do video courts? And being able to say, let's take away all the all the factors of why people can't get to court, because it's not just taking an hour off of work to go to court. When you get a court date in a court time here, you're going to sit there all day. That's a whole day of work. If you don't have transportation and you don't have childcare, you can be able to take the half an hour, 15 minutes, because court's really, 15 minutes usually, and do that on a Zoom. I think that there's this change, there's going to be a change. And if we can continue to stay engaged and push back and not fall away and just say, well, it's good for now. We've done this through the pandemic and things will go back to the way they were before. Instead, we as the community need to still just stay on it and continue to push back and say, we're here. Look at, this is our way to the new world, right? This is reform at its greatest. Is we were able to half the jail population. We were able to half the workhouse population, and things are okay. Things are good.
And as long as that doesn't lead to like a normalization of just increased home detention, because I could see them saying, well, we've got a contract now with this video visitation and remote censoring company, and because we're conducting court not in person, let's cut out because it's dangerous and expensive to have people that are willing to walk prisoners down to the visiting area. All these people have to get searched, and then we can cut on the cost of keeping people in these cells by putting them into their houses with ankle monitors and have them check in on a regular basis. It could, not to say
right.
the future that y'all are pushing towards.
We want to not promote e-incarceration. And that's a fine line, right? Is that if there's incarceration and then there's e-incarceration, and we don't, we also see a lot of times there's what they are calling diversion in courts are working with diversion organizations, and you have to push back against that also in some way, which makes it hard, right? Like, yeah, of course we want diversion. Of course people want to be home and we'll put on a ankle shackle, right? And to be able to be home. But at the same time, you're over policing, we're over incarcerating, we're over surveilling people. We don't need that surveillance on people. They'll come back. They'll do that on their own. We're not going to demand, put a shackle on them and say, well, you can't leave the house for only this amount of time. Well, you're not even charged yet. That's bizarre and then a lot of times what happens with people, especially pre-trial, and if they are using, electronic home monitoring, that time's not being counted towards if they do get convicted and sentenced to, a sentence, served. They're saying, nope, that doesn't count because you weren't home. Well, I was incarcerated in my house. So there's a lot of work, I think, nationally that's being done around that too. And we support that. It's like, we don't, yes, we need some, it's the same thing when you're talking about bail reform. A lot of times we should be having services, let's supply services instead. Let's make sure that they can get to treatment. Let's make sure that they can do these other things. And, do they need this? Do they need that? Well, yes, that's great. But that in releasing people without bail, they don't need to go together. We want to absolutely support the community, but if that's not available, if someone decides they don't want to go to treatment or that's not what they need right now, that shouldn't mean that they should stay incarcerated, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like this fine line of like, yes, we want all these things and services in the community and resources to go there, but that doesn't have anything to do with ending the cash bail system because it's unjust and they don't need to be incarcerated to begin with.
So there's been this push nationwide to, as a part of the decarceration, at least during the pandemic, to, and I think you said this, but like to change the patterns of police interaction with communities, to maybe cite people without arresting them if there's some sort of issue going on, to put people in less contact with the jails. There's also been documented, and this is like very, very like visible in New York, and partially because there's a lot of resources and people are concentrated there, but this very uneven distribution of that shift in interactions with law enforcement. Maybe it's a continuation of the same old thing where the majority of arrests that have happened there for instance, like violating the COVID rules have been impressed upon like Black and brown people. And you've got video at the same time of like, while Black folks are getting tackled by the police, you've got white young like yuppies or whatever in a park being like laughing and flaunting those like safety precautions and being handed masks very friendly by cops. I'm wondering if, but besides the big elephant in the room that we're going to talk about in a moment with the killing of George Floyd, if you've noticed in general like shifts in the way that police in Minnesota or in Hennepin County in particular have been interacting with folks.
We've seen, that there's people that are, especially, I would say, in people without homes, the encampments that we have, there's a lot of policing around that and a lot of, like, you need to be wearing masks. And it's going to be, I think it's going to pick up a lot more because we do now have there's been a order that you must wear a mask in public, both in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so we're going to see how that plays out. And, of course, if you don't have means to have a mask, right? You're not going to be able to have one. And we're going to see how the police react to that. It's going to, it's such a strange time and to see what's going to happen with it and us trying to stay on top of it. And not just us, but so many other organizations and police abolition groups that are navigating how to respond to this, right? Because of course we want to make sure that everybody in the community is safe from, a potential virus, but we also want to make sure that rights are not being violated. And how do you balance that, right?
Yeah, that's a question for sure. And definitely getting people the resources that they need, or not stopping people from having the resources that they need, means that they will be able to take care of themselves better, which I think this is like, obviously the kind of work that your project is doing is by like stopping that, or at some level stopping that extraction of resources, whether it be human beings, human energy, human lives from their neighborhoods, from their communities and their families, but also the money for bail and bond.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the last few days there have been large marches and even like conflagrations with law enforcement and riots concerning the lack of arrest and accountability in the case of the killing of George Floyd by Officer Derek Chauvin. He was fired. People have been outside picketing at his house. 3 other officers were fired. He's just been arrested, and I believe charged with manslaughter and murder. Like it shouldn't be, but it's kind of a high bar compared to how the U.S. like legal systems interact with law enforcement, because they're given so much leeway to say that they were afraid for their lives and, get off scot-free. But can you talk about the work that the Minnesota Freedom Fund has been doing? What are other organizations you're working with to support people as they are in the streets and protesting and grieving this murder?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm going to just shout out to a lot of the organizations that are on the ground doing the work, and Black-led youth organizations like Black Visions Collective. We have Reclaim the Block. We also have Twin Cities Coalition for Jamar Clark that are on the ground. We have Northstar medics who are on the ground doing the work that's right there on the front lines. And, we as an organization want to make sure that that's where support needs to go to first and foremost, because they're really putting their bodies on the line, risking arrest, risking injury, risking death, missing work. And for some of them who were going through this pandemic and COVID have already lost income and are already facing economic issues. And we are just trying to be here and hold steady for what's going to happen, right? And we know that this particular police department has long history of terrorism and abuse of power and a lack of justice that's ever happened from this police department. And we just want to continue to uplift those organizations that are doing that work. Again, we're able to support any way that we can that has to do with bail and getting people released and connecting them with attorneys and doing that work. But there's people that are really at a high risk right now, and that's really where we want to focus our attention on.
I think that it's good to point attention and support towards those groups. I know that because of the way that policing operates in the U.S. in particular, while stuff is really popping off in Minneapolis, similarly, there are ongoing struggles that are continuously popping up in other parts of the country. So Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, and the case, people pressing for his case to be recognized in the release of that video. There was the killing in late March that, sparked a protest last night, at which a few people were shot in Louisville. There was the killing of a black trans man in Tallahassee, Florida in the last few days. And so I was wondering if you had any notes for folks that are in those communities and looking to set up some sort of bail fund, if not just at least for response to police repression of their protests in the moment, if not a long-term bail fund like y'all have had for years.
Yeah, I think that the first thing is to reach out and find out who is doing this work. There's community bail funds in pretty much every state, and there's multiple ones, and seeing who is doing the work and has been doing the work long term. I think there's a lot of times when something like this happens, there's this panic of how do we reinvent the wheel? Well, if you partner with somebody that's already been doing the work and is set up and has those systems set up and knows this work intimately, it's going to take that stress off of doing it, from the ground up. If there happens to not be one in the area or one that's doing work there, connecting with the National Bail Fund network and being able to they have amazing support. There's, I would say, Pilar Weiss is phenomenal. She's the executive director, and we go to them all the time and ask questions and advice and look for partnership, and they're always available. I think that those are really the primary things, because this is work that we do day in and day out, and to try to just do it off the cuff is there can be a lot of issues that happen in that way, a lot of stress. And so just partnering with them, if we can be of any help just for giving advice and, saying, this is what we went through, this is how we've done it. We're here also. And that's part of it. We're all a big community, right? And so how can we support them from afar? I think that's the advice that I would say. It's pretty hard to be able to just do single fundraisers for a specific group when you don't know what's going to happen. Just like I said, with ours, we don't know what the charges are going to be. We don't know what bails are going to be set at. We have no idea. We don't know when people will be charged, because it's not just hey, there was this protest last night and people were arrested for disorderly conduct and now they need to be bailed out. We know that these charges can take months up to a year for people to even be charged, because there's ongoing investigations. So I think it really depends on that also. But like I said, there's a lot of resources out there and a lot of people that are just really ready to support in any way that they can.
Somebody just sent me a link to an article in Vice talking about Minneapolis bus drivers refusing to transport protesters to the jail, who have been arrested. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. And we're not seeing right now. There is a big push. Like I said, with Ramsey County, we've heard that they were given the call to not arrest people last night. But again, that's for, more of the protesting. We don't know what's going to happen later when, there's been businesses that have been destroyed and other things, property. And we know in the United States, it's usually property over people, unfortunately. So, yeah, it's hard to determine what's going to happen. But it's also amazing to see people standing up and saying, no, we're not gonna transport them. We're not gonna be a part of this. There has to be somebody that stands up and says no. We've also seen, that's been pretty amazing. Also, there's been the University of Minnesota has cut most of its ties with the Minneapolis Police Department in the last day, as well as Minneapolis Public Schools have also made the announcement that they're going to cut ties with the Minneapolis Police Department. And that's amazing, and it's also about time.
Yeah, that's amazing to think that there won't be police officers hanging around the halls and harassing people. And also, it's, there are so many things that are important that are provided by public education. The inculcation of police being a good response or answer to harm that exists within community schools are such a pipeline for that. And it's amazing to hear about a public school system that's taking a stance on that.
Yeah, and that's what needs to happen, and it gives hope. There's these shreds of hope that are happening here because, and I'm not going to say that there's a shred of hope because he was arrested, because we know that that's
Yeah.
That doesn't mean anything. That's what that was. And, they arrested him. Yes, that's what we've been calling for. But let's make sure that you convict him. And let's not wait 2 years before that happens. And let's make sure that he is actually held accountable, right? Like being held accountable. And we'll see the other 3 officers, nothing's happened to them yet. And we've had this before, right? Like this isn't the first time. Like I said, we went through with Jamar Clark, and we've went through this, in the neighboring city of Philando Castile. And it now isn't the time to rest and calling for justice. Now is the time to continue to push and to continue to push. And we know systems like to play games and wear people out. And so we have to be in this for the long haul.
Well, Tonja, thank you so much for taking the time. Is there anything that I didn't ask about that you want to mention?
No, I just, again, I really want to make sure that we're putting focus on the Black-led and Indigenous and Brown people-led organizations that are on the ground.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. Here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
You're listening to Dissident Island Radio.
Live every first and third Friday of the month at 9 p.m. GMT.
Check out www.dissidentisland.org for downloads and more.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.